started. Hey everyone, welcome to the 16th Annual Women's Policy Leadership Institute. Thanks for joining us. Our workshop today is Navigating the Legislature. The Women's Policy Leadership Institute is a program of Montana Women Vote. Montana Women Vote works statewide to engage low-income and Indigenous women and their families, LGBTQ folks, Two-Spirit and non-binary folks, Black, Indigenous, and other Montanans of colors, and their allies in the democratic process as informed voters, policy advocates, and community leaders. We're grateful for this time with you all, and we're excited to be here. We hope the information presented will inform your efforts in your community, and we look forward to staying connected with you to advance state policy that works for low-income folks in Montana. So I'd like to go over a few things that might be helpful when you participate in today's event. So you're muted automatically, but you can unmute yourself by clicking on the microphone icon in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, or you can press *6. If you're accidentally unmuted, one of our hosts may mute you. It's nothing personal, it's just to make sure that we all can hear what's going on, and if you meant to be unmuted, just let us know. We encourage you to ask questions and talk with the other participants using the chat function, which is on the bottom bar on your screen. It's like a little bubble. You can submit questions by typing them in there, and we'll review those throughout the process. You also have the options to turn your captions on and off using the little CC box at the bottom of your screen, and you can adjust the size by clicking the arrow. If you have questions or you have technical difficulties, you can put them in the chat. There'll be staff watching for them, or you can call our staff at 406-317-1505. We'll put this number in the chat box periodically. Feel free to give us a call. We are also recording today's session, so if you miss something, recordings will be made available to you along with any of the materials made in the session. At the end, we'll ask that you complete a short evaluation of the session to let us know your thoughts. If you do our evaluation, it'll enter your name into a raffle to win a Visa gift card or a signed copy of What We Don't Talk About When We Talk About Fat by Aubrey Gordon, who was our keynote speaker, and it was really awesome and it changed all of our lives. And I would just recommend that you try to get that book. Okay, cool. Well, now that we've got that covered, let's get started. So in this workshop, we have a few goals. So we want to demystify the legislative process and share experiences about how it all works. We want to share concrete tools with which to navigate the legislative session. And we want to get ready for the 2023 session. It'll be here before you know it. I know that the even years go by super fast, almost faster than the session does. So hopefully we'll get to see you there engaging in our work, or you can go ahead and engage in the interim. Overall, we really just want everyone to feel prepared to engage in the legislative process because it can seem really intimidating and uncomfortable. It doesn't always feel like a place for everyone, whether on purpose or not, when it actually should be a place where every Montanan feels like they can have a say in what, the future of their state looks like and what their communities are all about. So.
Okay, sorry, it took me a minute to get myself unmuted there. Hey everyone, I'm S.J. Howell, training alongside Hannah. Thanks, Hannah. We're going to jump into the first section of this workshop, which is understanding the legislative process. And I'm going to go over basically a bunch of pretty straightforward parts that make up the legislative process. Some of this may be really familiar to you. for others folks, it might not be as familiar. Before I jump in, I will just say this. We're going to go through quite a lot of information in a short period of time. And the legislative session, you know, it is not easy to understand and navigate the legislative session after 1 hour of a workshop. Like Hannah said, the legislative session is complicated, it's fast moving, it has its own language, lots of jargon, lots of wonky stuff. And, you know, I think that a lot of us feel like that is for a reason, because it really consolidates power in the hands of those people who are up there professionally being paid to do it. And that is not most of us. So I will just say, you know, we do this workshop as often as we can, at least every year at WPLI. And we're happy to do it any other time with other community groups or organizations, because we think that this stuff shouldn't be a barrier to participation. And also, we have to participate even if it doesn't feel comfortable, because that's how change gets made. So all of that being said, let's dive in. Montana's legislative structure. So we have 100 legislative districts. Representatives, there's 100 representatives in the House and 50 senators in the Senate. Each representative represents one district, which is more or less 10,000 people, and each senator represents two districts, combines about 20,000 people. And you'll see that every Senate district is like 2 House districts combined. The legislature meets every other year in the odd number year, or sorry, the odd number years. The even number years are the election. The odd number years are the session. And this is a little unusual. Most states have a legislative session every year. There's a handful that meet every other year. So what this means is that our legislative sessions are very intense. There's a lot that happens in those 90 working days. Representatives serve 2-year terms. So that means that representatives in the House are up for re-election every time a statewide election comes up. And senators serve 4-year terms. And there are term limits. It's 8-year term limits in each chamber. So you can serve 8 years in the House, 8 years in the Senate. This is a map of what our legislative districts look like right now. So you'll see, for example, that some of the districts in rural parts of the state are really quite big. And there are other districts, you know, these little squares inset that are the bigger communities, the bigger cities. Districts are really quite small. I will also just say that these districts are all set to change in 2024 based on the redistricting process. And that redistricting process is pretty important. It draws these district lines, and it, you know, it really has a lot to do with how people are represented in the legislature. So keep your eyes out for that in the coming year. Now, once the legislature is elected and you know, post-November election, everyone who's serving in both the House and the Senate is assigned to serve on committees. Legislators serve usually between 2 to 4 committees each. And committees are a really important part of the legislative structure for a couple reasons. Bills are first heard in committees. When we think of like testifying at a hearing, that happens in a committee. So our chance to go and speak directly to legislators on a bill happens in committees. And the first vote that happens on a bill happens in committees. So a lot of times, whether a bill moves forward or dies right away is based on committee structure. I want to point out a couple quick things. So the House and the Senate have different names for their committees, even though the committees handle the same bills and the same, do the same sort of process. And I don't know why this is, other than it's just like, it seems like one of those complicated things that we should fix and we don't. So you'll see at the very top of the list, for instance, on the House side, the first committee is called Agriculture. On the Senate side, it's Agriculture, Livestock, and Irrigation. Now, the House Agriculture Committee does talk about livestock and irrigation. They just have different names. That's kind of an easier one. A more complicated one, on the House side, the second committee you see on that list is Appropriations. Now, appropriations is the process of basically spending money. But in the Senate, that same committee is called Finance and Claims. So they do the same work, but different names. Similarly, one committee that we are in a lot is Human Services on the House side and Public Health, Welfare, and Safety on the Senate side. So, this is one of those things where it just takes a little time and a little practice to get used to understanding which committees are which. The legislature also has leadership. This is the leadership that is currently serving. They were elected at the January of 2021, and they'll serve through the end of this year. And you'll see that there's leadership on the House and Senate side. Leadership is important for a variety of reasons. The leadership, and particularly the sort of majority leadership, so Speaker of the House and President of the Senate, these folks have the ability to assign bills to certain committees. They make those committee assignments, which is really actually pretty important. They set the schedule, and they have a lot of, say in some of the sort of behind the scenes procedural stuff. So, for example, if you wanted a bill to die sort of a quiet death by missing a deadline, if the leadership wanted that to happen, they could probably make that happen, just as an example. So these leadership, the folks in leadership positions are pretty important, and leadership is elected. They're elected by their peers. So the House Majority Caucus elects the majority leaders, the Minority Caucus elects the minority leaders, same on the Senate side. And timeline. So I mentioned that the legislature meets for 90 working days. They start in January of odd number years. I like Hannah's reminder in the chat that legislature is odd. True enough. So usually they meet starting sort of the first full week of January, and they meet through April. You can see here, this is a snapshot from last year's session. You can see that they start out not meeting on Saturdays, but about somewhere around February, they start meeting on Saturdays as well. So they meet 5 to 6 days a week, and they count those days as, legislative day 21, 22, etc. There's a break and a deadline about midway through called transmittal, and it's sort of cut off, but right down at the bottom of your screen, you can see transmittal break scheduled in March of last year. And it's sort of like spring break for the legislature. It's a 3 or 4 day break. It's a long weekend. And it's also an important deadline where many bills have to be transmitted or sent from one chamber, either the House or the Senate, to the other chamber. So if they miss that deadline, they die. And that brings us to the last piece of sort of understanding the legislative process, which is how a bill becomes a law. Now, again, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, and I will say, there's an exception to every rule. The way that I'm going to explain it is basically the process that's supposed to happen, but there are always changes, and that's also part of the process. But essentially what happens is a bill is introduced, and it's introduced by a legislator. So that person is called the sponsor. Every bill is sponsored by one person who does the work to get the bill drafted and introduced. Let's say in this example, it starts in the House. So a representative introduces the bill. It is referred to a committee, and that is done by the leadership. So they'll look at the bill and they say, okay, this bill has to do with Medicaid. It belongs in Human Services. And it goes first things first to a committee hearing. So the Human Services Committee schedules a hearing. They hear the bill, and then the committee takes a vote. At that point, the bill can die, at which point it's done just like that, or it can pass out. And the committee report is that process. The committee is basically reporting to the whole House to say, either we killed this bill or we passed this bill. So in this instance, let's say the bill passes. It goes to the floor of the House for what's called second reading. And second reading is the first sort of full House vote. And this is also when the entire chamber, the whole House, will debate the floor or the bill on the floor. So this is where we get some, dramatic speeches by legislators and that sort of thing. And once that's done, once that debate is done, they take a vote. Again, at this point, if the House as a whole votes the bill down, that's it, the bill is dead. But let's say in this case, they pass it. Then it goes on to what's called third reading. And third reading usually happens the next day after second reading. They're not allowed to happen on the same day per legislative rules. And third reading is another vote of the whole House, but there's no debate. They just say the number and the title of the bill, and folks vote. So it's basically each chamber votes twice. If the bill passes again, it's sent, you can see this, this little arrow, to the Senate, and it starts all over again. It's sent to Senate committee. The committee has a hearing and a vote. The full Senate has second reading and then third reading, those two votes. And if it passes the whole process again on the Senate and nothing is changed or amended, it's sent to the governor, and the governor either vetoes it or signs it into law. Now, a couple things about process here. We all know that bills can be amended or changed. That can happen either in committee or on the floor, but the most likely place is in committee. If the House passes a bill and the Senate amends it, depending on how big those amendments are, they sometimes go to what's called a conference committee, which is made up of both representatives and senators to try to either agree on those differences or to send it back to the House to go through the process again. So I know that that's a very quick and dirty version of this, and there's a lot of ways that things can go sideways and look a little different, but this is sort of the most standard process for how a bill becomes a law. So that was a lot. I'm going to take a short pause and say if you have questions on any of this, drop them in the chat. And I'm going to hand it over to Hannah to talk about legislative tools.
Okay, sweet. So there's a handful of tools that we can use to access information, track bills, and just like generally make engaging with the legislature a lot easier. Most, if not all of them, are available online. So this is just like the home page of the Montana State Legislature. So there's like the bill search, which will like end up going over. You can look up your legislators and find like contact info. or I think it has an option where you can enter your address. So if you don't know, which honestly, don't be ashamed of that. There's a lot going on. And then session information. So there'll be like all the reports from like different committees and things like that, and the rules. And then the revenue and the budget, obviously, is like all things like numbers, which just isn't really my thing, but it might be your thing. Okay, cool. So this is where you can look up bills. It's honestly really fun to do sometimes. So you can like look at the past legislative sessions, and you can also look at like the most recent one. So you can kind of like look by subject. So there's a bunch of different subjects. So the other day when there was like a voting rights workshop, I was looking at like the election one. You can look by legislator, that's pretty fun, or primary sponsor. You can also look based on like all of the numbers, so like the bill type and the number, bill draft number, and the chapter number. A fun fact is that these used to be books, and I think you can still buy the books to look up bill information. Okay. So this is how you can like live stream meetings. So sometimes they'll have video and sometimes it's just audio and sometimes it doesn't work, but most of the time it works. I've found. And basically like almost all the hearings and the floor sessions are available online, which is really nice and makes it super accessible, especially if you're far away from Helena and you're tracking a bill, or you're in like a really rural area, because the state is so huge. And it's just a cool way to see what's happening. You can watch it even if it's not like live. Yeah, so. So like I said, this is how you find a legislator. So it says you can look at maps, you can look at the roster, you can find all their general contact information, what committees they're on, which can be really helpful, especially when you're tracking a bill, all that kind of stuff. So we'll talk more in a minute about when to contact a legislator and why to contact a legislator. But in the meantime, this is the legislative switchboard. So a couple options. If you call the phone line, you'll talk to an operator who will take a message down for you and deliver it to a legislator. And then you can submit an email through this web page. And yeah, you can also, sometimes legislators like the phone number listed when you look them up using the page we just showed you. They'll have like cell phone numbers. So sometimes you can even text them or call them like it's their personal line. Or you can write a letter. Yeah.
Right. So a couple things that came up in the chat as we were going through this, just going back to sort of committee structure. Again, legislators are assigned to committees by legislative leadership. And I will say that the party that holds the majority in the legislature has final say over that. So we do end up with committees that are stacked in certain ways, and that is by design, and that the power to do that rests with whoever holds the majority. So right now, of course, Republicans hold a majority in both the House and the Senate. So you will see that the number of Republicans and Democrats on the committee sort of mirrors the overall proportions in the legislature, and who those people are is up to the Republican leadership. But any legislator can introduce a bill on any subject, regardless of what committee they serve on. So let's say there's a legislator who serves on agriculture and transportation, but they have a bill that would be heard by human services. They still introduce that, and then they go introduce that bill to the Human Services Committee. So that's a great question. Okay, so this is the second half of our workshop. This is the sort of fun part. We talked about understanding the legislative process, sort of what the building blocks are. Now we're going to talk about influencing it and how and when and what the most effective ways are to get in there and try to make our voices heard and change the outcome of bills, whether that's supporting or passing good bills or killing bad bills. I will just say, keep those questions coming in the chat. If you don't want to use the chat, you can put up your little raise hand icon. Hannah and I might not be able to see that because we've got this PowerPoint going, but we'll try and get somebody to flag us in the chat and let us know that you want to ask your question, not on chat. So here again is this how a bill becomes a law slide. And I want to talk about a couple of things. The first thing is that one of the best times to influence legislation is before any of this starts. And that is one of the most difficult and frustrating realities of the legislative session, because sometimes we don't know that a bill is being drafted. You know, you can sometimes see bill drafts, you can sometimes see by the title of a bill, even if there's no language in laws, the bill search website that Hannah showed earlier. But a lot of times you don't know this. If you do know, especially if like a bill that you're supporting, if you know a legislator in your community is working on a bill, don't wait, go talk to them now. If you know that a legislator carried a bill last session that you were really interested in and they're running again, or they are, you know, a senator whose term isn't up, go talk to them now. But if you can't influence a bill before the session starts, before the bill is introduced, the most important time is during committee hearings. And that's the only time when the public can give testimony. So again, there's usually two chances, right? A House committee hearing and a Senate committee hearing. Some bills are heard in more than one committee, and that's usually bills that cost money. So let's say there's a bill to improve dental benefits in Medicaid. That bill would first be heard in Human Services in the House, but then it would also be heard in Appropriations because it would cost however much money. So in that case, you get 4 committee hearings, but mostly you get 2. And finding out when a bill has a hearing, you can do that again through laws. Hearings are scheduled quickly. Sometimes you only get a day or 2 of notice. Sometimes you get a week or more, but usually not that much. And you want to take that opportunity to testify if you can and talk to the legislators who are on that committee. And one of the reasons for this, again, is that one, only legislators speak on the floor. So once a bill has heard its hearing or has had its hearing, you can talk one-on-one to legislators, but you can't publicly testify. And 2, committees are usually made up of, you know, between 10 to 20 legislators, depending. Senate committees are smaller, House committees are larger. But, you know, the number of votes that you are trying to influence is much, much smaller in committees. And so you often have a much better chance of being able to influence how legislators are thinking about the issue, making sure that they are hearing your story, etc. So when to give public testimony, the first and most important way that we try and influence the outcome of a bill is in those committee hearings. So let's talk briefly about how to testify at a hearing. Now, I included virtually because last year, of course, folks were able to testify virtually through Zoom. I do not know if that will be an option next year. None of us do. We might not know until next January. You know, I think that having virtual testimony was a good thing and it allowed more people to be involved, but there's no guarantee that that will still be available. However, interim committees are hearing testimony virtually still, so that's something to keep in mind. Now, a few things to know about testifying at a hearing. Arrive early or log in early. If you are in person, committee rooms can fill up. They have limited numbers of seats. And so, you know, getting there early means you get to be in the room. If you don't get a seat in the room, don't worry. You can wait in the hallway and the staff will make sure that folks get a chance to get in. There are sign-in sheets at the door on a clipboard, and you want to sign in with your name and whether you're a proponent or an opponent, you're supporting or opposing the bill. That sign-in sheet goes into public record. You know, you want to turn your cell phone off and be sort of quiet. If you're not, they'll kick you out. So it's a good idea to pay attention to that. Prepare your testimony ahead of time. I know that's sort of common sense, but it's a good idea to write it down. Be prepared to give a 2-minute version or even a 30-second version. If you have a lot of information, including like facts and figures or statistics, it's great to have a written statement with copies. If you are able to make a copy for everyone, they'll hand that out right then and there. If you only have one copy, you can still give it to the committee secretary and they will make copies for everyone. Dress appropriately. So this is really up to you. There is a dress code for legislators in the Capitol, which basically comes down to like business dress and no jeans. There is no dress code for people who are not legislators, but I think it's worth knowing ahead of time what the general atmosphere is so you can dress in a way that makes yourself the most comfortable. If you're testifying remotely, you are not allowed to be on video, so dress however you want. And then use legislative hearing protocol. And that's what this is at the bottom. And you'll hear this if you listen to committee hearings, you'll hear everybody use this same protocol. And if you don't use it, you'll often get interrupted and they'll prompt you to do this. But this is really, it's about getting your information onto the public record. So first you direct your testimony to the chairperson of the committee. So Mr. Chair or Madam Chair or chairperson, members of the committee, my name is S.J. Howell. You spell your last name, H-O-W-E-L-L. And if you're there with an organization or you represent a group, you say, you know, I'm here representing Montana Women Vote, and I'm speaking in support or in opposition of House Bill 123. And that sort of opening sentence is more or less required / expected of every person who testifies. And then lastly, be prepared to answer questions from the committee. So I will say most folks who go to testify, especially just with like your personal story, aren't going to get questions. But again, if you have a lot of statistics, facts and figures, or even if you have a story that maybe is unusual or folks haven't heard before, you should be prepared to be called up and asked questions. And I will just say, again, the most important thing to keep in mind here is that you can say, I don't know, or I don't have that information, but I'll try and get it for you. You're not required to answer any questions, but when you testify, you do make yourself available for questions. And lastly, just a few quick tips. Again, plan ahead. write your testimony down. I know many people, myself included, who have decided to wing it, and you go up to the podium and you get a little nervous and you either you ramble or you forget your main point or whatever. It's really good to write it down. Shorter is better. And I know that, there are times when we feel like I've got 10 minutes worth of stuff to say on this bill. But the truth is that legislators, they're like anyone else, they're going to zone out at a certain point. So if you can get your information under 2 minutes, legislators will appreciate it. They're more likely to, remember it. But also sometimes time is actually limited by the number of people who are testifying. So you'll get into a hearing and the chairperson will say, all right, there's 30 people giving testimony today. Everybody gets 2 minutes. So in that case, if you've prepped 10 minutes worth of something, you're going to be scrambling to reprioritize in the moment. So having that short version is really important. Practice, read it aloud if you can ahead of time. If you're sharing a personal story, it's really useful to limit your story to the relevant experience. I feel like a lot of times when you're sharing your story, for us, the sort of background and the context and the details of our personal experiences and stories is really important. But for legislators, not so much. So you want to leave all of that out and keep it short and sweet. And then once again, use that legislative hearing protocol. The last thing that I'll say, and then I'm going to hand it back over to Hannah, is that testifying in committee hearings is one of the most common ways that we can share our thoughts to legislators, but it's not the only way. We're going to talk more about that in a minute. But if you're working on a bill, it's sometimes useful to just speak to folks one-on-one. And if you do that up in the Capitol, a couple things to know is that it's really hard. I think sometimes we're like, okay, I'm going to call and schedule a meeting with this legislator during the legislative session. But most legislators just don't do that. There isn't time. Their days are booked from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. You just have to go up to the Capitol and find them and catch them. And it's very difficult to do this, but it can be really useful. And all of these tips, plan what you're going to say, keep it short, practice, write it down, all of that applies if you're going up to try and catch somebody in the hallway. And the only other thing that I would add is that it's really useful to ask directly for what you want. So, Representative Smith, will you vote against House Bill 123? Just ask directly and then give them a chance to share what they have to say. There's a lot of other ways to influence the legislative process, so I'm going to hand it over to Hannah to talk about some of that.
Sweet. Thank you. So other ways you can influence legislation is you can write letters or emails to legislators. Just like testimony, be concise, make it personal, describe what you want them to do. So I want you to vote yes for blah, blah, blah. I want you to vote no for blah, blah, blah. Oppose, support, all really cool words to use. And then include your name, your address, and a little about yourself. You can organize a phone bank. This is kind of a fan favorite. Organize a phone bank and call folks and ask them to call their legislator in support or against, or literally just let them know that bill is going on and let them decide. That's even empowering. And then you can write a letter to the editor. And honestly, I think a few of the Montana Women Vote staff would have contacts throughout the state. So if you just reached out to us, we could help you with literally any of these, but especially LTEs. You can use social media to influence legislation. I've seen that used a lot more frequently. And you can collect like personal stories and deliver them to a committee or a certain legislator, or you can hold a lobby day. So lobby days are pretty fun. It can be like really empowering to have like a group of people, your friends, your community members, to lobby together during the session. You don't need hundreds of people. You don't need even 20 people to make it a fun lobby day. Just prep what you're doing, and just use some of these tips for extra visibility. So you could wear matching shirts. You could go get some craft supplies from Joann's and make it a little like get ready party. You can make buttons, you can make stickers, any of that stuff, just so that you know, you're identifiable as a group. You can have a friendly legislator introduce your group from the floor. So contact you know, any of the legislators you know or you've had good experiences with, and just say, hey, I'm in town. We're here. Can you introduce us? That can be really fun. And if you can, you could host a lunch. Legislators are similar to other people in the way that they like free food and snacks. Yeah, everyone likes free food. So that's one generally secure way to get a legislator to show up, is give them free lunch. This is the stuff no one tells you about. So stairwells are a good place to kind of catch in legislators. You can send notes to a legislator on the floor with a page for $1. So I was a page in high school, and basically you just like do like chores around the Capitol. And it's like an honor, but you do chores. And so you can basically just find a page and they'll have a little name tag, and give them $1 and they'll send a note. You can find most of the cell numbers in the guidebook. There's tons of information on the first floor at the desk, including what bills are being heard. There's a lot of times there's free food at the Capitol, and there's a free food Twitter account. I didn't know about this until we were prepping this. Make sure to watch what you bring into the Capitol. You're not really supposed to bring food or drink into the galleries. Backpacks aren't allowed in the gallery. Basement bathrooms have like free supplies and they're open to the public, even though it kind of looks like really scary down there. And yeah, nobody successfully works a session alone. So you gotta like find your group of friends and, you know, kind of stick together with them.
All right. So we purposefully left a decent chunk of time here at the end for questions and discussion, because again, you know, we can run through all of this and there's no way to fit everything in an hour. So I want to take the next 10-15 minutes to hear what kind of questions folks have. I'm going to stop sharing the screen. So you can put those questions in the chat, or you can pop your video on if you want, or just unmute and ask those questions. What do you want to hear more about? What experiences have you had that you think other folks should hear?
Hi, my name's Mindy Farrell. I'm over in Sanders County. Where can we find these recordings? Because when we start training volunteers to interact with the legislative session, it's going to be, the organizers can kind of know the information ahead of time, but really we're not going to train anybody till December. So is there going to be a library that's available? This has been a great, a primer, if you will. So thank you so much for that, but I'd like to know where I can find the recording.
Sure. So we'll post the recording of this session on our website, montanawomenvote.org, in the next day or two, and it will be up there for the foreseeable future. And you can also feel free to contact us directly, email a staff member if you want a copy of the PowerPoint or the notes or any of the other materials.
Thank you.
Question from Rebecca here in the chat. Best strategy to fight voter suppression laws. Where is our voice most effective? In committee. So great question. Rebecca, yes, the best place for a lot of that is committees. Most voter suppression laws will come up in the state administration committees. And those committees, again, it really depends session to session, who's on those committees and sort of how friendly they are, but sort of best case scenario is you find enough committee members, so that likely means legislators of both parties who are willing to vote down voter suppression laws, and you work with them, you build relationships with them, you get them a lot of personal stories, you get them tons and tons of phone calls and emails from people, especially in their districts, but really from everywhere, urging them to do the right thing. That's in my opinion, the best strategy. It is also, I mean, that was definitely a strategy used by us and many other organizations last session, and it wasn't enough. Sometimes, sometimes the deck is just stacked against us too much. But the other thing to do in that instance, if you are able to take the long view, and Rebecca, I do know that you are able to take the long view and work on this year after year, is when you're out registering voters or just talking to your friends and family and community members, talk to them about voting because of these specific issues and tie the issue to their vote even before we get to the legislative session. And hopefully over time that helps us start to shift the balance of power so that we have a little bit more of a shot of fighting those bills. But I would say voter suppression in particular, that's an issue where we should just make as much noise as possible using all the strategies that we've talked about.
I have a question.
Sure.
May I ask it now?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. I'm wondering if we have some kind of, I don't exactly know what to call it, announcement system that would allow us to network with people across the state when important issues are coming up. Because I feel that as a Montana resident for many years, 30 years now, that I often don't know what's being talked about or what's important. So if we don't have it, can we start one? Because I think it's really important, and maybe you talked about this and I missed it, in which case I apologize and you could give me a link or something.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. And it actually links a little bit to the other question in the chat about not seeing what bills are being debated until it's too late to testify in committee. And I think, you've really put your finger on one of the hardest parts of legislative organizing, which is that things happen really fast. And there are a number of ways that we try to sort of announce what's happening. At Montana Women Vote, we do weekly legislative bulletin emails, and those go out. We try to send them out every Monday, and they say, here's what's happening this week. And, it's what the bill is, when it's being heard, how you can testify. Or if there's a bill maybe that was heard last week, but it hasn't been voted on yet, who to call and how to do that. So you can sign up for our email list. The challenge, of course, is that any given week in the legislature, there's 100 bills being considered easily. I'm not exaggerating. If you have, a dozen committees meeting every day on each side, that's House and Senate, each committee is looking at 3 or 4, maybe more bills a day. I mean, it's hundreds of bills. So there's going to be some things that we don't have the time and capacity to focus on. So what I would suggest is looking around, or, ask us, ask other folks who do this work, if there's a specific issue you really care about, which organization is doing the most work, and then get on their email list as well. But, I would love to see some sort of like every day, every bill announcement system. And so far, what I have seen in my experience over the last 10 years is that the volume is just too much. We either can't keep up on the organizer side, or people get really overwhelmed and can't figure out can't find what they want in that level of information. So I would say, let's keep that conversation going. If folks have suggestions, put them in the chat. Somebody recommended Forward Montana's newsletter. I second that. The Montana Budget and Policy Center has some great info. Following those organizations on social media is also a good way to try and keep on top of it. But it is a tough issue. One specific thing with the question about tracking bills. So there's a couple things you can do. If you go to that laws.leg.mt.gov webpage that Hannah reviewed, you can make what's called a preference account, which is just like a personal account, and you can flag bills based on their title, and you will get email notices from the system about bill hearings and when they're scheduled. That is often really difficult, in part because you're trying to figure out sort of, what the bill is from often very generic bill language. But you can see down here, thank you, Hannah, establish a preference account. And basically this just lets you, you could do something like, okay, I'm going to flag every bill that Representative John Fuller introduces because all he seems to care about is attacking trans people. So I want to know when those bills are coming up. That's an example. Or you could say, I'm going to go to the subject drop-down menu, and I'm going to choose, I'm trying to think of a good one. I'm going to choose environmental protection because that's something that I care a lot about, just as an example. And then every bill that is flagged in the back end as an environmental protection bill, you can add to your preference account and get that notice. It is true that there is a requirement that there is public notice of the hearings. But again, that just means they go on the website. You still have to go and find them. I'm loving the suggestions of organizations in the chat. So folks can definitely follow those, and those organizations are all good ones, especially some have email lists, some have social media, some do both. I want to scroll back to a question about equal representation on committees. That's a good question. And the answer is no, we do not have equal representation on committees. Committee makeup mirrors the representation in the legislature as a whole. So for example, if in the House there are 60 Republicans and 40 Democrats, then committees will usually be ish 60% Republican and 40% Democrat, but the majority party gets to basically negotiate how many seats on which committees there are. It is a process that is both like so important to the outcome of legislation and also really happens behind the scenes before the session starts. But yeah, it is stacked against us unless we're in the majority. And I don't want to presume anybody's party affiliation here, but that's the way committees work. So we are just about at the end of our time. We do have another workshop starting in 4 minutes. I will just say that the list of organizations that has been put in the chat and other suggestions, I think it's a great idea for us to, on our end, compile those and put them in a document, and we'll put them up on our webpage, on the WPLI webpage, along with the recording of this and the PowerPoint that we went through. So that'll all be available for you. I just want to say thank you again for joining us. And at Montana Women Vote, we love when people want to get involved in the legislative session. It makes the legislative session so much better. So if you want to do this training for your community, or you want us to come and do this training for your community, get in touch. And one of us or two of us will sit down with you and figure out what works best. We can wait until December, but heck, we'll do it next month if you want. Be in touch. Thank you so much for your work. Just as a reminder, we're going to drop the link to the evaluation form in the chat. Get a chance to win some prizes if you fill that out and put your name at the bottom. But also importantly, we just like to hear what you have to say so we can continue to do this and improve it and make it better and make it work for folks. I will kick it over to Hannah for any last thoughts or words. And then our next workshop, starting in 2 short minutes, is local elections and municipal organizing, which is also super exciting and as important as the state level legislative work. So stick around for that. And for the next few workshops that we have, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, you can find that info on our website. Hannah, any parting words?
Yeah, I'm just gonna say thanks everyone. It's been like fun to kind of relearn as I prep this workshop with Howell. And yeah, I know the legislature can be really intimidating and scary. And I mean, even just walking up the hill, like honestly, I'm out of breath. So it can just be, it can be a lot. But just try to remember that like you matter and your voice matters, and these folks work for you, and that's your building because you live in Montana. That's not like their building. Like we all share it in my mind. Yeah, that's all I want to say. That's everything.
All right, thank you so much. We appreciate you being here. And I do believe that Danny on our staff is going to introduce the next workshop. So Hannah and I are going to drop off, and Danny, I will kick it over to you.